Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome back to part B of our lecture regarding mobilizing the home front during World War II. So we left off with the advancements, and sometimes lack thereof, for Mexicano men and women in the United States as they mobilized to produce the wartime machine. But one of the reasons for fewer gains for the Mexicano community during World War II was in part, yes, racial discrimination, but part because they were still stereotyped as merely migrant farm laborers. And while this was technically true in pure percentages, that was changing in the United States. It was slowly converting to more and more Mexicanos and Mexicanos living in cities. But that stat seemed more real to Anglo-America because of one other World War II program, the Bracero Program. You see, as before, when there are major migration patterns and shifts in the United States, that would be a result of the outbreak of war, right? We talked about this in World War I as well. Farm workers begin to leave the rural areas and move into the cities to find, well, either go to war abroad or move into the cities to find jobs in the wartime industries. That happens. And just like World War I, agribusiness cry labor shortage. As a result, we talked about this a little bit in World War I. We call it Bracero Program Light in World War I. Well, the official program, Public Law 45, is this international agreement as the governments of Mexico and the United States agree and develop this program known as the Bracero Program that translates into one who works with their arms. This becomes a binational agreement between both countries. It starts in 1942, designed to bring workers from Mexico into the United States to take part on the farms to make up for the labor loss due to the war emergency. And so 1942, this is implemented, and Congress officially makes it begin under Public Law 45 in 1943. Now, between 1942 and 1945, the war years itself, 4.5 million workers from Mexico will enter into the United States as temporary workers on a contract labor basis. They will occupy positions in the field and food processing plants. They are designed by law to be temporary workers, usually on a 6 or 9 month contract, at which time they'll have to leave the country and then reapply for the program again. Now, remember, this is a joint international agreement negotiated between Mexico and the United States. And knowing the history of racism in the United States, Mexico insists for some worker protections that include employers have to pay for the trip to the United States. That's important. They need transportation. Number 2, they need to pay braceros, the local, or pay them the same wages as local workers. So number 1, finance the trip. Number 2, pay the same wages. Number 3, provide reasonable accommodations. Number 4, permit them to shop wherever they wanted to, not make them buy at the local store. And number 5, the agreement guaranteed a minimum wage of 30 cents per hour and humane treatment for workers. So these 5 things are big important. And then there was number 6. Knowing the history of racism in the state, Mexico negotiated that Texas, which would not receive any bracero workers. Let me repeat that. Knowing the racism historically in Texas, all the problems with the FEPC already during World War II, Mexico negotiated that Texas would not be allowed to receive bracero workers. Now, officially, Texas said, well, we didn't want any braceros. Because in their reasoning for this, of course, was they didn't like being told that they would have to accept those so-called restrictive stipulations like paying them a fair wage, providing decent housing, treating with humane treatment, paying for their trip. Now, please note, by 1947, after the war is over, Texas will finally relent. There will be a renegotiation, and they will start receiving braceros as well. But initially, Texas is excluded due to rampant racism. Now, effort was made to shield braceros from discrimination, but nonetheless, braceros will still encounter exploitation, inadequate living conditions, and rampant discrimination. They will live in barrack-style housing, living within segregated camps on property, and would have to be taken in the back of trucks into town, into cities on the weekends to shop. And what it made for is a very interesting dynamic. As oftentimes on large farms throughout the country, I don't just mean Southwest, I mean in the Midwest, in the Great Lakes, in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, you would often have like these separate groups in camps on within each farm. Like there would be a part of the farm designated braceros. There would be a part of the farm designated for migrant workers. There would be part of the farm designed for local permanent workers. And they would also be separate from the whites who lived on the farm and in the cities as well. They were very excluded as braceros. Oh, by the way, fun fact, this temporary emergency wartime effort lasted until 1964. Now, just to be clear, World War II ended in 1945. So 19 years later, making it a long, enduring program that surely outlived its initial intent. Perhaps. Or perhaps because the program was designed to provide cheap, temporary, disposable, migrant, proletarian workforce laborers. Maybe it did exactly what it was intended to do. And of course, for U.S. growers, this is a godsend that would result to more than 300,000 Mexican farm laborers entering the United States. These were single men who labored on contracts, which, by the way, is in violation of U.S. law, who were tied theoretically to one farm, one place, and who would never be eligible for citizenship or voting. They were forced to stay in tract housing, set up that often lacked proper facilities. They were not allowed to strike. But for Mexicans, there was a bright side. And for Mexico specifically, there was a bright side. Braceros would send more than $30 million per year back to Mexico in remittances, making the Bracero Program the third largest industry in Mexico. This was a boon for the Mexican economy. And this was honestly a pretty big boon for braceros. They were lining up for this to apply for the program. It was a chance to make some good money compared to what they were doing in Mexico, coming out of the Depression very slowly there. But despite the economic gains, the implications of the Bracero Program racializes the Mexican as a commodity, as merely stoop labor to be bought, sold, exchanged, and discarded. And it all begins with the process. You see, before crossing the border, they would be forced to enter into these stadiums just across the border in Mexico, while U.S. inspectors began to kind of poke them and prod them and check them all over. It was said that they would check for what were called new wounds, like open wounds or fresh, cuts on the hands. because those with new wounds would be rejected for not being able to deal with the hot, hard work of the fields. And so for aspiring applicants, these were like casting calls. People of all various backgrounds, bakers, mechanics, waiters, carpenters, construction workers, agricultural wage laborers, all the same, would be required to perform a type of backwardness for U.S. officials. As one historian put it, no city slickers need apply. Men were reduced to their hands, calluses, and muscles. They were chosen specifically by performing this backwardness as well. They would actually pretend to be backward, docile, humble Indians, because that's what U.S. growers stereotypically sought. They didn't want someone who would collapse in the fields. When they pictured a Mexican, in their minds, they're picturing a dumb, docile Indian who would be easy to control, whose hands are calloused from years of working in the fields. And so that's what Mexicans would do. They would perform this. They would put on a stage show, basically, for these growers, these inspectors, pretending to be something they really weren't. It was that they didn't wear big old belt buckles. They would dress very humbly. And then if they're selected, then they'd be put into a shower room where they would be deloused with DDT. Their clothes washed and disinfected while they showered. As one bracero said, quote, "Thousands came every day. Once we got there, they'd send us in groups of 200, as naked as we came into the world, into a big room about 60 feet square. And then men would come in masks with tanks on their back, and they'd fumigate us from top to bottom. Supposedly, we were flea-bitten and germ-ridden," unquote. What this did, though, is it transformed and constructed the Mexican into a one-dimensional commodity function and utility. They were being devalued for nearly everything that held meaning to the term Mexican. The individual self, the family, the culture, the political experience of being Mexican didn't matter anymore. It was devalued, ostracized, and cast aside as other, disregarded by the inspectors of the United States. They were merely tools, the same as going to purchase a new plow or tractor, shovel. That's all they were. And this was a continuation of equating Mexican culture with diseased, seasonal, migrant stoop labor that was central to creating a very negative stereotype of all people of Mexican descent, ultimately impacting the perceptions of Mexican Americans as well. And of course, as thousands of Mexican braceros crossed the border, coming into new areas of the country as states began requesting braceros, it would all result in new and amplified racial tensions. Now, we're going to talk more about the racial tensions regarding Mexican Americans in the next lecture, next time. But for now, though, while African Americans and Mexicanos would see increased, though uneven, economic opportunities, other groups in the United States did not fare so well. Take Filipinos here. In order to thank them for their war effort, the U.S. was going to grant the Philippines its independence finally. But the impact was that all those workers who had been allowed free access to the United States since they were part of the unincorporated territory that belonged to the United States since 1898, these workers were now given an ultimatum to get out or become undocumented. what this resulted in was, after gaining their independence, the big thank you for the help in the war was really a big, yeah, we're going to keep making you a colony of the United States. And so what changed was now that the people were now citizens of the Philippine Commonwealth, not of the United States, which means they were now in the quota system, which kept them from immigrating. You see, if nativists believed that Chinese and Japanese were unassimilable because they were racially different from Euro-Americans, both racially and culturally, they were still felt the same way about Filipinos' ability to Americanize. They basically viewed Filipinos as either being A, Indian, B, Asian, C, Black, or D, all the above. Is that while they will serve notably in the war effort, the reward is Filipino independence. So that's a positive. But in the short term, it really hurt the Filipinos who are in the United States. And we would see a continued colonization of the Philippines by the United States as a nation, despite having their independence. Now, while they were the first group to be made illegal as immigrants, the Chinese did make some strides of acceptance in World War II as allies of the United States against the Japanese. This would include a repeal, finally, of Chinese exclusion in 1943. I mean, it was kind of hard to justify Chinese exclusion when they're helping you fight against the Japanese. However, despite this very positive gain, the director in charge of visa applications in Hong Kong would harshly, arbitrarily, and without care deny, suspend, or put in limbo those applying for a U.S. visa. In fact, it was said he would go and search their homes and say that entire families were not acceptable for immigration based on the fact that maybe one child had a different blood type. Now, we all know that's not how blood type works, right? But he said, no, your one son has a different blood type, you're all excluded. But even the so-called friendly nature of this newfound friendship between the U.S. and Chinese is very short-lived. Because by 1949, just 4 years after the war ends, the Chinese nation experiences the Chinese Communist Revolution, the advent of the Cold War. And once again, we take a harsh stand against the Chinese. But the group that suffered the most was obviously the Japanese Americans. Now, obviously, after Pearl Harbor, there was intense anti-Japanese sentiment, and Japanese Americans would face far more harassment than either the Germans or the Italians. For example, the Idaho governor, you see the quote on the screen saying, quote, "A good solution to the Jap problem would be to send them all back to Japan and then sink the island." Well, we didn't quite do that. We tried to sink their island a little bit, but we didn't send the Japanese Americans back. Instead, in 1942, FDR issues Executive Order 9066, which orders for the removal of Japanese Americans from their homes to what were called war relocation camps. You see, Americans were worried about Japanese Americans inside the United States for fear of spying. And though some Americans surely would condemn the camps, the Supreme Court upheld the executive order's validity, that the president has power to intern the Japanese based on the 1798 Enemy Aliens Act that was still in the books, and given the executive branch the broad authority to, quote, summarily apprehend, restrain, secure, or remove all non-U.S. citizens, natives, denizens, or subjects of a hostile government, unquote. The result of this was the forced relocation of first and second generation Japanese immigrants into these relocation camps, these internment camps that were definitely not concentration camps. That's what the Germans did, right? Now, officially, the United States never formally stripped Japanese American citizens of their citizenship, but in effect, it nullified it on the grounds of racial difference, presuming that all Japanese in America to be racially inclined to disloyalty. Note the eugenic argument here. The United States removed some 120,000 Japanese. 2/3 of them, 80,000, were citizens of the United States from their homes on the Pacific coast and put them into 10 internment camps in the interior. Despite 2/3 of them being native-born American citizens, many Japanese Americans still fought for the United States. Despite the fact many were forced to sell their land, their farm, their businesses for pennies on the dollar, and they'd be transported to poor housing under armed guard. Families were now allocated a space of 20 by 25 for living space. Toilets, laundry, and bathing facilities were all communal. The camps had schools, hospitals, but poor housing and the loss of economic agency and civil rights. There was even a loyalty questionnaire given to these U.S. citizens of Japanese descent that included such questions as, will you renounce all loyalty or citizenship to Japan? So this is for non-U.S. citizens, those of Japanese descent who were not eligible for U.S. citizenship based on the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. And so if the EC, in this case, the name for the Japanese nationals who live in the United States, if you chose to renounce all citizenship to Japan, think about the implication of this. So you agree to prove your loyalty to the United States, that you will reject your Japanese citizenship. Knowing that when and if you do this, you will not be eligible for U.S. citizenship, meaning you will now be stateless, countryless, homeless. One question also asked if you would be willing to join the army whenever the U.S. asked you to, which of course would break up families. And of course, if you say no to this, you're seen as disloyal, as suspect, maybe a spy. If you say yes, you'll be shipped out to fight whether you want to or not. One man explained it very well, how the U.S. tried to intimidate and harass the Japanese to leave. He said, quote, "They got me. The American government threw me in a concentration camp," his words, "labeled me dangerous because I wouldn't declare my loyalty, intimidated me, subjected me to extreme mental and physical duress. In fact, the government did such a good job of manipulating me that I just gave up my U.S. citizenship voluntarily. Now they can deport me to Japan without any trouble at all." Unquote. And of course, if you were deported to Japan, there was no hope of getting back or becoming naturalized again because you were not eligible for citizenship. It would not be until 1983 that the government finally recognized this injustice of the internment policy and would grant $20,000 in reparations for internment survivors. Though again, we've never actually acknowledged the problematic nature of the repatriation program regarding Mexican Americans of the 30s. But hey, slow progress, I guess. Now, as I mentioned, there was more extreme racism going on during World War II, and also as well as resistance by the Mexicano community. But we'll talk about that next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.